Let's learn how to work with the increment operator in C#. Let's create a brand new project, File, New, Project, and we're going to make sure it's a console.net framework, and let's go ahead and call it increment. Well, I'm going to call it my increment just to make sure we don't have any problems. My increment. Click OK or press enter. It opens up a brand new solution and project for you, and we're going to go ahead and leave everything named the way it is. Should be fine. And then what we want to do is we want to demonstrate how the increment operator works. The most common times I see the increment operator, which is a ++ sign, is when you're doing loops. You want something to go over and over again. I could create a variable. I'm going to call it iCount, and I'll go ahead and assign it the value of 0. Usually it's already assigned a value of 0, but I'd like to assign things just to make sure. And then I could go ahead and do a console.writeLine and display the value of iCount. And I'm going to go ahead and do a console.readLine, and we'll use that to pause our screen. And if I ran this program right now, you would see that it would display the number 0 on the screen and wait for you to press a key. Now, what would happen if I said, let's do the following. Let's say iCount is equal to iCount plus 1, and then let's go ahead and do another WriteLine and see what would happen. In this case, the logic should say iCount is 0, so it prints 0 to the screen. Then on the next line, we say that variable is going to be assigned whatever is currently in the variable, which is 0, plus 1. So 0 plus 1 is 1. It gets assigned back to the variable iCount, and when we print off iCount, it should say 1. So we should see a 0 and then a 1 printed to the screen, and then it waits for us to press a keystroke. I'll go ahead and start the program by clicking on the Start button. We see the 0 and the 1, and it waits for a keystroke. Instead of actually typing this statement, iCount equals iCount plus 1, I can shorten that. I'm going to comment that line out by simply saying ++. Now a ++ means the same thing as that line right there. It says take the variable and add 1 to it. However, in C# we have two different types of ++s. The ++ is called the increment operator, and it actually means that line right there, the same thing that we did there. We have a post and a pre. The pre is when the ++ comes before the variable. For instance, ++iCount. The post is when the ++ comes after the variable. So it would be iCount ++. Let me add one more line here to make that a comment. And there's a difference in how it actually works. The way that I remember how they both work is that the pre has an R in it. And the R means that that operator is really rude. The post has a PO in it. And that operator is very polite. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, watch the difference in what happens. This is the same thing as saying we want to go ahead and do the increment first and then display iCount. So if iCount was 0 right here, and we said do a pre-increment on it and then display it, that means we should see the number 1 show up. And I'm going to add one more line right here that says console.writeLine, and we're just going to display iCount without doing anything to it. So let's see what happens. First of all, we should see 0. Then it says take the variable, which is a 0, add 1 to it, and now go print it out. So we should see the number 1, and then here we should see the number 1 again. So we should see 0, 1, 1, and there it is. Because the pre is rude, or in other words, it says, I want to go first. No matter what else is on this line, I want to go first, and then you can go ahead and go, which is the console.WriteLine. So what would happen if we did the following? Let's go ahead and set iCount back to 0, and let's do those 2 lines that we were working with before, and instead of a pre, we want to do a post. The plus comes afterwards. Now remember, the post is really polite, and what it says is, I will be the last thing that actually executes on this line. So in this case, we set it to 0, we drop onto this line, and we say, oh, we have an increment operator there, but you know what? Why don't you go ahead and go, console.WriteLine. Go ahead and print out the contents of iCount, which is 0, and then I will increment to 1. Meaning, the next time that it prints off that iCount, there's going to be a 1 in it. So it should print off 0, and then it would do a 1, 0, and then a 0 and a 1. I'm going to comment these other lines out so they don't confuse you. So we should say 0, 0, 1. Let's run it and let's explain one more time why. 0, 0, 1. So why is that happening? Once again, this is a post increment. Post increment says if there is anything else on this line that has to happen, go ahead and do that first and then do my increment. So what else is there that has to happen on this line? A console.WriteLine. So the console.WriteLine executes and then the increment happens, which is why it first prints off 0, increments to 1, and now iCount has a 1 in it, and it prints it off. And that's how the pre and the post works. Now, how else could you use this? I could create a loop, and I could say while iCount is less than 3, and let's go ahead and print off the value of iCount. Now if I ran this, this is an endless loop. First time through, is iCount less than 3? Yes, iCount is 0. Is 0 less than 3? True. Drop into the while loop. Print off 0. Come back up. Is 0 less than 3? Yes, print off 0. Is 0 less than 3? Yes, print off 0. In other words, for this loop, you've never controlled incrementing of iCount. So we would have to come down here and do something like this. iCount equals iCount plus 1. But instead of writing a whole nother line of code, how about if we just do that? So now it says, iCount, is it less than 0? Yes. Print off iCount. Now why do you print off iCount before incrementing? Because that is a post increment, and it says everything else execute first and then I will execute. So that's almost as if you had this line below that other line, but we're accomplishing it simply with an iCount plus plus. This should print off 0, 1, 2, and then it gets out. And the reason it gets out is because it prints off 2, increments to 3. Is 3 still less than 3? No, get out of the loop. So what would happen instead if we did this? I'm going to take that line back out, and I'm going to say iCount plus plus. This would now say, is iCount, which is 0, less than 3? True. Increment, it goes to 1. Print off 1. Come up. Is 1 less than 3? True. Increment, go to 2. Print off 2. Is 2 less than 3? True. Increment, 3. come up. Is 3 less than 3? No, get out. So in this case, we should see 1, 2, 3 print out. So it all depends on where you put the plus plus. What if I put the plus plus right here? Now when I drop into the loop, I count is equal to 0, but we don't do the comparison yet because this is a pre-increment. So the first thing that happens is we increment I count, which used to be 0, now it's 1. Is 1 less than 3? True. Print off. Increment. Is 2 less than 3? True. Print off. Increment. Is 3 less than 3? False. Get out. So we should see 1, 2. You can even combine these by maybe doing a plus plus there and a plus plus there. What do you think would happen? Pause the video, take a look at the logic, and figure out what's going to print. Now that you took a moment to maybe look at that logic, let's see what happens. I count is equal to 0. Drop into the loop. Polite or rude? It's the rude one. It's the pre-increment. So we say take the variable 0, add 1 to it, 1. Is 1 less than 3? True. Drop into here. Polite or rude? This is the polite one. I count currently has the value of 1 in it because remember we incremented it here. It has the value of 1, and the polite increment says, hey, right line, go ahead. So it prints off the number 1, and then it increments to 2. Comes back up to here. The pre now says, what do you have? 2. Increment it to 3. Is 3 less than 3? False. Don't do the loop and get out. So we should see just the value 1. And that is the post and the pre-increments and how you could use them, especially using them in a loop. I use them all the time for counters because I don't like to do the I count equals I count plus 1. So anytime you have to take a variable and add 1 to it, instead you can use the post or the pre. And it all depends on what you're trying to accomplish to determine if you're doing a pre or a post.